righty. Well, Professor Strauss, thank you very much for joining me, sir.
It's always good to talk with you.
I appreciate that. If you wouldn't mind beginning by introducing yourself and the kind of academic work you've been up to in recent years.
Right, so I'm an experimental particle physicist. I study the fundamental structure of the universe. What are the smallest building blocks of the universe? How do those go together? I do my research at a laboratory near Geneva, Switzerland called CERN, where we shoot protons at each other at the speed of light. And for 24 hours a day, 6 months of the year, 40 million times a second, we smash protons together. We see what comes out, we understand the structure of the universe. It's kind of like smashing cars together to see how a car is put together. If you follow science news, in 2012, a particle was discovered called the Higgs boson, and I spent the last 10 years basically studying the properties of that particle.
Very cool, very cool. And also part of your work outside of your scientific works in particular, you also do a lot of work defending Christian theism.
Yeah, I talk a lot about how I think science and Christianity fit together and why I think there's no conflict. And in fact, I think science gives credence or evidence for the Christian God.
Wonderful. And we have chatted before on this podcast, and where we sort of left off was on the argument from design, and so that's what this episode is going to be addressing, specifically the kind of the broad question of, was the universe designed? And so if you'd like, we can just go right into it.
Let's dive in.
Wonderful. So you believe the universe was designed by the God of Abraham, correct?
Yes. I mean, what I would argue is that science gives evidence that the universe appears to be designed, right? That's all science can say. And then what's the best explanation for that appearance of design? Based on a number of other things, I think it's a transcendent creator who has the characteristics of God described in the Bible.
So when you describe a transcendent creator, do you think that it could be something other than the traditional monotheistic Abrahamic God, or do you think it points more so at the Christian concept of God than others?
So what I think is that, science itself, even if it said there was a creator, is only going to give partial characteristics of that creator. Think about looking at a piece of art, right? If you look at a Van Gogh versus a Monet, you learn something about the artist, but you don't learn a whole lot about the artist. You can tell some things, and if you analyze the paint, you might even tell more. When did the artist live, and things like that. So I see myself as looking at God's creation as a piece of art, and so there are certainly some things you can tell about the artist, and so that would tend to, preclude certain ideas of God maybe, and favor other ideas. But you certainly don't get to the whole, Christian or Judeo-Christian God simply by looking at the universe. It's just like you don't get to the whole artist by looking at one piece of art or his whole collection of art.
And maybe it'd be useful to back up here and address why you believe the universe is designed in the first place, why you would think that arguments that it's not designed, that it's a random, mindless process, why do you think those don't work? So
there's a lot of reasons. Let's start with what has been called the anthropic principle. The anthropic principle says that there are, there's lots of ways to approach it, but more or less that there are many parameters of the universe that seem to be finely tuned to allow life to exist, and that if you change these parameters any amount, you either have no universe at all or a universe that's inhospitable to life. So that's design. Take the mass of the proton. If you tweak it just one way or another, you basically don't have a universe, or a universe that's inhospitable to life. I study in my research called the strong force. It's the force that holds the nucleus together in atoms, or in the nucleus, and it holds quarks together in the nucleus, protons and neutrons together in the nucleus. And if you were to change it by making it weaker by 5% or stronger by 2% or something like that, you basically don't have a universe that can support any kind of life. So there are all these parameters that are scientifically shown to be accurate, to be true, that if you tweak them a little bit, you don't have a universe or one that can't support life. And because they seem to be so finely tuned, balancing on a razor's edge, it seems to look like it's designed.
Okay.
Now there are, if you don't believe in design, there are alternatives, and I read people who don't agree with me, so I could argue, the other side and what are the alternative explanations for this. But the idea that these parameters can't be changed much if hardly at all, if you want a life-permitting universe. That's pretty well established in the scientific literature.
Okay. So I'm very curious to go into some of those arguments that you've encountered before, but one of the common arguments that gets raised against that, the argument from design, is that, well, we're the sort of creatures that came about in this universe, and had the universe not been finely tuned in such a way, we wouldn't be around to notice it. So in other words, it's inevitable that we have what appears to be a finely tuned universe because we couldn't exist otherwise.
Right, that's called the weak anthropic principle, actually. The problem with that is there's no reason why the parameters have to be a very narrow range for us to exist. They could be a very broad range for us to exist, and then it wouldn't look like it's finely tuned. But we know, a book, for instance, by Luke Barnes and Grant Lewis called A Fortunate Universe, they are cosmologists who will run computer simulations. What would happen if you tweak these parameters just a little bit, and you basically end up with a universe that doesn't exist or is inhospitable to life. And so that would be a way that you'd say, well, it doesn't look designed. These parameters could be anything and we'd be here. The other thing is, within kind of the universe we live in, the only element of the periodic table in which life could really, in theory, be based on is carbon. Because carbon is the only element that will create long chains of atoms in which you could store information, like in DNA. And so as soon as you say it's carbon-based, the parameters are really, really narrow for at least anything more complex than bacteria. So yeah, you could certainly hypothesize, hand-wave other universes that might not have such narrow parameters, or you could say we just came about because we're in this universe. But you can imagine a universe where the parameters for life are broad and not narrow.
Okay. And so you've already alluded to the multiverse argument here that you are not a fan of, but that's another argument that people would argue against the argument from design, that if there is a infinite number of universes and most of them weren't finely tuned, actually the majority of the universe is barren, and we just happen to be in that lucky Goldilocks zone where we happen to have the constants for life.
Yeah, so I won't say I'm not a fan of multiverse. I'm a fan of what's true. If we find a multiverse, I'll be excited about it.
Okay.
And I can talk more about that even from a theistic viewpoint. But there are many multiverse theories, and none of them have any evidence for them. Unless you watch Marvel movies, then we know they all exist. But other than that, we have no real evidence for a multiverse. And certain multiverse theories, the laws of physics are the same in the other universes, so that doesn't help. And so even a multiverse is kind of a weird thing to put all your eggs in one basket. No experimental evidence for it. There are some theoretical reasons why we believe they might exist. But you can also make arguments that many, if not all, multiverse theories in and of themselves had to be finely tuned. You can make arguments that some of these ideas that would lead to a multiverse give the potential of a multiverse, but don't necessarily give an actuality of a multiverse. And so it kind of kicks the problem down the road. It's almost a non-theism of the gaps. Well, there might be a multiverse, and if I get the right multiverse, then I can say I'm in the right universe. I'm not sure I want to build a whole philosophy on that.
Okay, fair enough. Anything else by way of arguing for a designer or arguing against arguments against the argument from design?
Well, I'm talking primarily about physics, but you could talk about biology. I know that, someone who believes in just kind of random mutation, natural selection, will say the design of, in fact, Francis Crick, who discovered DNA, says that we have to keep reminding ourselves that the biological design isn't real design. And so, biological systems are so well designed, and you can try to attribute that to evolution, but evolution doesn't mean that there's no designer, right? Unless it's truly a random walk that gets us here. Certainly there are many Christians who believe the mechanism of evolution works so well that it looks designed. And so, you see design everywhere, from the subatomic world to the intergalactic world to the biological systems. I don't think you just see it in one area.
Well, focusing on the biological one, I think this will be a good...
Oh, the one I'm an expert in, right?
Well, because this raises some issues. So at this point, we've talked about arguments for a designer, but that raises the question, well, what sort of designer is it? Is it a good designer? Is it potentially a bad one? And then when we look at evolution by natural selection in particular, it is such a harsh and brutal process where, especially the innocents, babies that are born, animal babies that are born, are the ones that are most likely to die, painful deaths, predation, and so forth. So it raises the question, if the universe were designed including natural selection, and yet natural selection is such a apparently brutal process, that raises questions about the goodness of the designer.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I'm not sure that a lion hunting for food is necessarily brutal. In fact, if you don't have predators, then herbivores get out of control. So at least within the system of an ecological system that we know of, certain of these things that are almost necessary, even though they might be, quote, brutal. So, I mean, I'm not saying that bad is good. But I am saying that it's a bigger picture than, the animal was eaten by a predator, therefore God must not be good. I eat meat, so clearly I don't believe that the death of an animal is a moral thing.
Right, but given that some of the suffering in nature, for example, like natural disasters and so forth, don't serve a obvious...
Don't bring this up, because they do.
Well...
Many natural disasters serve a very important purpose. So you have to have tectonic activity to have a planet that can hold water over years and years. Tectonic activity causes earthquakes. Earthquakes could be a problem, but they don't have to be. Why do we have so much death from earthquakes? It's because of economics. It's the way we build. Why do we have flooding when Hurricane Katrina hits the southern coast of the U.S.? It's because of how we build. If you talk to people that live in the Netherlands, they will say you don't have any flooding problems with these major hurricanes. You just have to build correctly, and that costs more money. So many natural disasters, probably even hurricanes, because the Earth is so finely tuned with its rotation rate and its heating capacity and everything, that you probably need hurricanes. I know it's true with earthquakes to have life. And so, again, I can't tell you why a designer would say, this is the universe I'm going to make. I can actually make some guesses. But given this universe with the laws of physics, for us to exist, natural disasters are required. They aren't an evil thing.
Yeah, I think it's worth spelling out our terms here. So I would agree that the system, if it is designed, is very well designed to continue propagation of life and so forth. And some of that may appear brutal, so like hurricanes or predation and so forth. But I think the key thing is that, well, I guess I should ask you this. Do you deny that there is a problem with suffering? That there is, in other words...
Of course not.
Okay.
There is certainly a problem with suffering. So again, I think the Christian worldview has an answer. The answer, let's take away natural disasters, because a lot of suffering is man-made. In fact, one could argue most of suffering is man-made, including the suffering from natural disasters because of the way we build it all. So, and I believe that the Christian worldview has the best solution to that. And that is that humans are made with dignity in the image of God, but fallen. So, your worldview has to be able to answer, why do humans seem to have such a dual nature? At one time, extremely philanthropic and brave. Someone will pull someone out of a burning car when they don't even know them. At the same time, being greedy and brutal, right? The Christian answer is because we're made in the image of God but fallen. So we have this dual nature kind of. So I don't know if that was close to answering your question. But yeah, there is suffering. I'm not going to deny there's suffering apart from human behavior. But I will make a strong argument that most of the suffering we as humans endure is because of human nature.
So I want to delay my response to the human bit just to focus on the natural suffering bit more, because I think that's the one that's more. Because yeah, so a Christian would answer that a lot of the human suffering, or maybe most, is caused by free will. It's sort of the upside to having free will, or sorry, the downside of having free will is that we get to do evil things, but when it comes to the natural world, when it comes to diseases, cancers, and so forth that don't visit humans, but just visit animals, I mean, that is suffering that, given a God that can do everything, knows everything, and is all good, and yet watches the preventable suffering happen, raises questions if it's actually a caring, loving God.
Yeah, and I, of course, there's no perfect answer. We're going to talk about design, and you said, well, if we do, we'll bring up the problem of evil. So there's no perfect answer to the problem of evil. I'm not going to pretend I have an answer that is completely satisfactory. And I'm not going to deny that evil and suffering exist. I will argue that I don't know the entire purpose of the creator and designer of this universe, right? If you are going to be an engineer who's going to build and design something for a purpose, there are always factors you have to take into account. And I, again, I can speculate why we currently live in a universe with cancer, childhood death, human trafficking is back to the human nature, but the things that we can't control.
Well, I'd love to hear your guess.
Well, first of all, the Christian answer is that this universe is not the end of the story, that there will be a future universe without all those things, so that once the purpose of this universe is accomplished, we can move on to that universe without pain and suffering. And so, that tells me that the purpose of this universe is to get to some end goal, probably, but it's not the end goal. So then I can only speculate on the purpose, and I have speculation, but I don't know if it's correct or not.
Well, if you can offer up the speculation. I'll offer some back if you'd like.
So again, I get in trouble because I'm talking Christian theology, which I don't even know is Orthodox Christian theology. I haven't heard too many people talk about this. So, and you have to believe the Christian story, right? And even that has parts I don't understand. Boy, this is way off of design. The Christian story is that at some point in time, there were supernatural beings who rebelled against God. Angels and Satan are real beings who rebelled against God. So you have the problem of evil, a rebellion against God and evil beings before this universe even exists. And so I believe that a good God has to take care of the problem of evil. And taking care of the problem of evil, I don't understand God's economy, but I believe that's the purpose of this universe. If you read the biblical story from beginning to end, within the first 2 chapters of the Bible, you have the problem of evil introducing itself. And in the last 2 chapters of the Bible, you have the problem of evil taken care of. And so to me, if the purpose of this universe is to take care of the problem of evil, which had been introduced even before this universe was created. So now I'm going to build a machine to take care of a particular problem. And to do that, it has to have particular characteristics, which to me includes moral, good and bad, evil, because we're going to take care of it. And so, according to Christian theology, that is what the death and resurrection of Jesus did. And so, if that's the purpose of this universe, then maybe the universe has to have some of this evil within its structure in some sense, or the potential for evil within its structure to take care of the problem of evil.
Yeah, that's an interesting theory. To offer back some speculation and also to design, maybe it's just a brute fact of the universe to exist is to suffer, and I think there may be some resources for this for Christians to invoke, right? So in the biblical canon, right, all the people that were chosen by God to be his prophets had some kind of struggle, some kind of suffering, and in the form of Jesus Christ himself, if he was God himself, he came to suffer, right? He was a man that lived a life of sorrow, so maybe it's just a brute fact rule of existing that you must suffer.
Well, in this universe, but again, we have a promise of a future universe where that doesn't exist. So what changes? Why does this universe, I agree, it's a brute fact of this universe, but it seems to be that there is the capability of creating another universe without that brute fact. But maybe it's possible that that capability can only exist once the problem of evil is taken care of.
Well, so moving on now from kind of the general theory of a argument from design now to a more specific Christian worldview, as you've been alluding to with the afterlife, this is also an issue I would raise in terms of the problem of suffering and as it relates to design, because the Christian worldview espouses that there is an afterlife, and the afterlife contains the possibility of heaven and hell. And Catholics believe in purgatory as well, but just focusing on the concepts of heaven and hell, there seems to be something that is at least iniquitous about this system of justice, where there's basically a one-size-fits-all system of justice where either it's eternal union with God or eternal separation with God. And it seems that the eternal separation of God, now I know many theists reject the view of it being literally hellfire and brimstone, and
well, some even reject the view of it being eternal. There's annihilationists who would say that ultimately in hell there's some kind of ultimate soul annihilation, so that torment, whatever you want to call it, isn't eternal. Again, the Bible doesn't say a lot about hell.
Sure.
So we are making speculation.
Well, and so see, the annihilationist view, I think that would be a much more just view, right? So if you could have, so say like a paradigm evil human being like Hitler, right? If there's a perfect intelligence behind God that can decide what a perfect sentence would be, and then have him, millions of years in hell, and then just annihilate him, that I wouldn't have a problem with.
So the Bible does allude to different levels of, quote, punishment in hell. Again, whether that means harshness or time, I don't know. But it's certainly, Jesus alluded to that. He alluded to the fact, this sounds cruel in our world today, but that those who deserve few lashes will get few, and those who deserve many will get many. And so to me, there is, again, we misunderstand hell. Nobody has to go to hell, and people choose to reject what they have heard about God, right? If let's take, if I was pursuing somebody as a girlfriend, I'm married so I wouldn't do that, but if I was pursuing someone as a girlfriend and they kept telling me no, and I kept harping on them, we call that stalking. Jesus pursues us, and we can choose to accept or reject, and he's loving enough to give us that choice. So this idea that God sends people to hell, I would argue, is not the right way, a Christian idea. The biblical Christian idea is, whosoever will, let him come and drink of the water of life. That's what Jesus said, whosoever will. It's an open invitation to everyone, and God is loving enough that if a person says no to that, he's not going to force them. That's what love is, right? If you let it go, if you love it, let it go, and if it loves you, it'll come back. That's love.
Interesting. Yeah. So that account of hell is a much less problematic account for me. The idea that there are like striations and levels of punishment, that would be a much more...
Well, that I think is definitely within Scripture. Annihilation is a doctrine that some people will hold to based on certain passages of Scripture.
I would be curious to hear the defense of that, because I'm recalling, not with precise language, but a few verses of Scripture where it describes the soul as being eternal.
Yeah, again, I don't know. It's not something I've studied a lot. I do know there are theologians who try to defend that view.
Okay, yeah, interesting. Well, that would be interesting on following.
I'm sure you could Google it and find out.
Yeah, we'll do. But remaining with the Christian worldview and potential issues morally with design, In the Bible, it expressly forbids certain forms of sexuality, for example, homosexuality. And you could argue that these folks that are born homosexual, it's part of the design behind their biology, their mentality, or psychology. I don't know quite how to describe it, but yet it seems anathema to the moral prescriptions of God. So that seems like a problem with design.
Yeah, so, I mean, I don't know. Yeah. I think that there is a whole lot of, first of all, every person is made with dignity in God's eyes. It does not matter your sexual orientation or, whatever. It doesn't matter what you do. In God's eyes, you're made in His image and you have dignity. I would just say this, right? If there is a designer and creator of human existence, then that designer and creator would know best how humans flourish, right? If I was to make a machine, I'm going to know best. I mean, not that humans are machines, but if I'm going to make a machine, I know best how to make it work well. And so what I would say is the description of sexuality in the Bible is set up for us to flourish.
Okay.
Now, we could go into details, and my views are probably not going to be, completely acceptable in the culture we live in. But they would have been acceptable probably for the other tens of thousands of years of human history, which is interesting. I mean, we are in a sexual experiment in the last 50 years that is unprecedented in human history, to be honest. And it is unclear where it's going to lead to, actually. It's unclear whether it's good or bad, actually.
Yeah. That definitely is we're in a new era of approaching sexuality. But I think there may be, perhaps on this topic, too much room between us. So maybe we could just agree to disagree on this one and move on to another issue.
Well, we can agree that it's unprecedented.
Sure.
That the consequences, if there are consequences, have not yet been realized. And so we'll see.
We will see eventually. Yeah. But another issue of design, that seems where a person is naturally designed in a certain way that's morally anathema to the prescriptions in the Bible. For example, people that are born with violent psychopathy, people that are sociopaths and serial killers that have severe mental illnesses, that it's questionable whether or not these are freely willed agents. As we mentioned earlier, the Christian account of the problem of evil in the human case often refers to free will as the cause, but in the case of people with severe mental illnesses that are also very violent, that complicates that picture.
Well, again, there is the general rule and there are exceptions to the rule. And we can bring up exceptions and go for 20 hours, right? I don't know the answers to all the exceptions. What I will say is the God of the Bible is just and fair. And so I cannot tell you the solution to every exception beyond the norm of human experience. But I am confident that if the God of the Bible is true, and if people die and stand before Him, no one will be able to say to Him, "You have not been fair and just with me." How that works out, I don't know. I'm not God. But, I think this is an issue we deal with with society. I mean, it's always possible to bring up fringe cases and try to build a whole philosophy on those. But I would rather build a philosophy on the huge part of the bell curve in the middle, and then those fringe cases are less problematic in some sense. We always make exceptions. I teach a class of 200 people. 95% of them take a test in the room together, but there are 5% who have accommodation, ADRC accommodation, and they do it somewhere else. I don't build my whole class around them. But I do allow for those exceptions so that it's fair for them.
I would push back slightly in that you design your syllabus to allow for that.
Yes.
So if that was consciously...
So I think the God of the Bible has designed a syllabus that says, I'll be fair to everyone. But He hasn't spelled out every exception and what that means.
Yeah.
I don't spell out every possible ADRC exception.
Mm-hmm.
I just say we will accommodate you.
Yeah, and another question that this would raise is for folks who have not had the gospel, the Christian gospel, spread to them, whether or not that's a issue. But I think we may have even discussed this before.
I think people will be responsible for the revelation they have had. Mm-hmm. And again, I don't know how that's all going to work out. You can't be responsible for what you don't know. Mm-hmm. Now again, how much you should know from nature, how much, I don't know. Mm-hmm. But it's not my job, so I don't have to worry about it.
Fair enough. But as it relates to the natural processes and so forth, I mean, you described earlier your speculation that maybe the purpose behind the universe is to ameliorate the problem of suffering. But do you see any evidence of like a teleology of an endpoint goal to evolution in particular?
That's interesting. I don't know, but there's a lot going on in the development of how evolution actually works. We are learning. I mean, I'm not an expert in this, so I just talk to experts. But there is a possibility that there may be a teleological development in evolution. So it's not purely natural selection and kind of random mutation. There's a small group of evolutionary biologists who are pointing out some, I forget the exact terminology, but some teleological aspects that may be part of evolution. I think the story's not completely told yet.
But like what sort of teleological? I mean, is this like functions of hands, or is this like?
No, it's more at the biochemical level. I mean, which is what drives evolution, right? I mean, and again, I've talked to evolutionary biologists recently about this, but I don't remember all the details. I think that, I mean, I'm a physicist, I'm not a biologist, so we're talking way outside of my realm. But I think we need to be. I mean, I personally, in what I've read from biologists, am not convinced that if there's not some foreknowledge about evolution, that's probably the wrong word, that it doesn't work. I mean, Richard Dawkins, the classic book is, The Blind Watchmaker. This is one of his first books on evolution. And he's going to give an example of evolution. And he's going to randomly type letters, and he wants to come up with this sentence, "Methinks I am a weasel," right? But every time he hits on the right letter, he keeps it. If you just randomly did it, you'd never get. And he's calling that keeping the right letter natural selection. But it's not natural selection. It's intelligent selection. He is saying that as soon as he gets the letter that teleologically he knows has to be there, he keeps it. He knows the end purpose. So when I first read that book, it made me not believe in evolution. I mean, because I go, if this is the best if this is the example you give me, where the only way you get what you want is you know what you're trying to get to at the end. That's not natural selection. That's, intelligent design with a small I. If you give me a mechanism of evolution that operates that way, then I think, it's teleological.
And Richard Dawkins is an interesting example to bring up because, as you mentioned in the Blind Watchmaker, he references the view that evolution and organisms and biospheres look so intricately well put together that it looks inevitably like it was designed. Right. But still, I'm a bit confused about what you've been alluding to in terms of purpose, because I can see the purpose. So, for example, like the evolutionary teleology of a wing is to have flight. Right? And so in those evolutionary ancestors that didn't have a wing, but they had like a little flap or something like that, I could see how you say the purpose is ultimately for it to be flight. Is that what you mean, or do you have some other?
No, what I mean is that, again, I'm not the expert in this, is that, for instance, we have, I think, 20 amino acids and certain functionality, and some of the biochemists are starting to say, and why do we have a racemic mixture of 20 amino acids, that when you look at the physics and chemistry of this, you're going to have to end up with these 20. It's not a random walk. It is a function of the physics that is involved in producing these amino acids, this kind of thing. That rather than we randomly walk to get the building blocks of life, it's within the laws of nature, you're going to end up here. So it's not so much the functionality of a wing as the biochemistry that helps us even create life in the first place.
Okay, interesting.
And then maybe even evolve life, right? So maybe that same kind of mechanism that says and again, I'm not an expert in this, I've just talked to a few people, and this is a relatively new idea held by a minority of biochemists, as I understand, but they're not theistic biochemists. They're just looking at the evidence. So I'm way outside of my field. So for those online, if I'm totally off base, I could be, because I'm quoting or I'm remembering and paraphrasing people I've talked to in the field.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
So another question relating to the argument from design is whether or not this design is flexible, whether it was more like a row of dominoes put in a row, or is there something that can be updated? Is there something, do you have a take on
certain
that?
aspects of the design of the universe, I don't know what you mean by that. I mean, a lot of it is the physical parameters of the universe, the mass of particles, speed of light, blah, 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 mass density of the universe. Those things aren't going to be flexible or change or anything. Not sure exactly what you're asking.
Well, partly what I had in mind is if you take the biological history of the Earth, right, there was a time before humans, and maybe if there was a God that was overlooking the Earth, maybe part of the update of his design was to include an intelligent, rational being that could be made in his image.
Again, the Christian would say that was all the purpose all along, but you got to prepare an Earth for that, right? And the primordial Earth would not have been able to support humans. And in fact, if you don't have a 4.5 billion year history of the Earth, you're not going to have the resources that we need for a technological society. Without the history of the Earth, we wouldn't have coal and natural gas and oil. So we wouldn't even have a technological society. So I would say yes, in the sense that one could argue that even the history of the universe as we know it is beneficial for us today.
Okay. But there are certain issues with the idea if it was set up in advance, even as you mentioned, that the primordial Earth was necessary for us to have this technologically sophisticated society in the first place. This raises issues about the fall of man, for example, right? So if the Trinity, you do believe there's a Trinity, right?
Yeah.
The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So if that had existed from the beginning of time, it raises the question, well, why was the Son around if the Son is our salvation, our Savior, the thing that redeems the fall of man? Does that mean the fall of man was inevitable? Was it already known to God before he created us?
So you tell me how an infinite being deals with time.
I can't.
Neither can I.
Yes. There's an important difference between us, though. I don't espouse theism, and you do.
Okay, so, all right, that's fair enough. One of the reasons I believe, I mean, this is going to sound weird. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it sounds totally logical. One of the reasons I believe that God described in the Bible is the correct God is that there are aspects of him that are incomprehensible, right? If I'm going to invent a God, it's going to be a God I can understand. And most of the gods of world religions, ancient gods, the ancient gods acted just like humans. They just had superpowers, right? But there are mysteries about the biblical God that would be paradoxes. I won't say they can't be resolved, but there are things I don't understand. That, to me, gives credence that this might be a true picture of what God is like, right? If you try to explain yourself, your cognitive thinking to a bunch of ants, they're not going to get it. They're not self-aware. You have aspects that they're not going to get. So if God tries to explain himself to creatures, like us, there are going to be aspects that we don't get, and that to me is an indication that maybe that's real. I mean, I don't know if we talked about the book Flatland last time we got together, right? Here's a three-dimensional being trying to explain himself to a two-dimensional being, and he can't. So if a three-dimensional being can't even fully explain himself to a two-dimensional being, he can use analogies and blah, 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 then certainly an eternal, infinite God is going to have mysteries that I don't understand, that are explained to me in language that I get, but that I can't fully comprehend what it means. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's speculations why God must be a triune God to be eternal. One of the speculations is one of God's characteristics is love. Love needs an object to love. How do you have love if there is not a triune God with no object to love for eternity? So if God is perfect love, that requires a self-sacrificial love throughout eternity. Who's he going to love if it's not this kind of Trinity God? So there are speculative theological reasons why this is valuable or necessary to have a triune God. But I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting. So far we've been focusing here on the earth. We're broadening out further to the universe. And I know we have talked about it before, and you're skeptical of the idea that there is life on other planets.
No, I'm not skeptical. Well, I'm skeptical of the idea from a purely naturalistic viewpoint, because you can do back-of-the-envelope calculation for what it takes to create carbon-based life, and it's really hard to make such a planet. Bacterial life can thrive anywhere, extremophiles, but anything more complex. So what I would argue is that if I live in a purely naturalistic world without a designer creator, then the likelihood of finding other complex life, more complex than bacteria, is very, very small. If there's a creator, then those odds are totally out the window.
Well, let's run with that. So let's say there is a creator, and the creator created other alien civilizations of intelligent species. What would they also be a species that, and let's stipulate for the sake of argument that they are as intelligent and moral as human beings are, would they need Christ to save them?
I don't know.
Fair.
Well, so let me tell you what, again, as a Christian who believes the biblical narrative is true, the biblical narrative claims there are other intelligent, self-aware beings. We call them angels. It seems to be, we're speculating because there's not much information, but it seems to be they were given an opportunity once and only once to either follow God or not. And if they chose not to, there was no redemption. So if that's true, then God's plan for them is different than God's plan for humanity. So if there's other life, how many possible plans are there? I don't know.
Have you followed any of the work where people have, because I know this is an emerging field in theology of what the implications of alien life would be. Have you been following?
I don't know if it's an emerging field. I think some of the early church fathers talked about this kind of thing. But I haven't followed it.
If you have anything particular you'd like to say about that, I'd love to hear.
No, I can't be 100% certain. You're bringing up things that I've read once or twice, but I think the idea of whether or not there are other species and other life in the universe, I think actually the common belief was that there was among most ancient people, right? Because they believed in spontaneous generation. So life's going to sprout everywhere.
Yeah, but I guess the reason I raise that, we can move on if this is outside of your comfort zone, but
everything's been outside. What are you talking about? What do you mean? We haven't talked about physics at all.
Well, let's go there. What would be your intro to for someone who's not a no training at all in physics? What would be your kind of crash course into why, as a physicist, you think it's most defensible to say there is a designer?
I think A Fortunate Universe is a great book. Okay. Luke Barnes and Grant Lewis. So they're cosmologists, Australian cosmologists. Luke Barnes is a Christian. Grant Lewis is an atheist. And they spend 2/3 of the book, and it's an easy read, relatively easy. They spend 2/3 of the book talking about the design of the universe and defending that against the alternatives. Then they spend the last third a dialogue between them, where Luke Barnes, the Christian, is claiming that it's best explained by God, and Grant Lewis, the atheist, is trying to explain it's best it's best explained by a multiverse. But I love the first 2/3 because you have people with completely opposing worldviews agreeing that the parameters are really finely tuned to make it look designed.
Okay.
So A Fortunate Universe is an excellent book.
So, and is the core of the argument for a design universe in that kind of the fine-tuning argument?
Yeah, I think from a physics point of view, that is the core of the design argument, is the fine-tuning. I mean, that's what is written in the physics papers, is these parameters that can't be changed. But there's even more to fine-tuning. One I like to give is a little obscure, but I study the strong force, which is the force that holds quarks together and protons and neutrons. It turns out that within what's called quantum field theory, particles can pop into existence from those the space-time vacuum of the universe. So within every proton in your body, these particles are popping into existence and going away for fractions of a second. Some of those particles that pop into existence and go away are called top quarks. Together, they weigh 700 times, is it 700 times? Yeah, about 700 times more than the proton. So if we could see that in the macroscopic world, it's as if you're walking along and all of a sudden 2 elephants pop into your body that weigh 700 times more than you and then go away. And this is happening in every proton in your body. If you take those top quarks away, those, we call them virtual quarks, if you take those virtual particles away, it changes slightly the mass of the proton. If you change slightly the mass of the proton, then you don't have a universe. So within this weird world of quantum mechanics, these virtual particles are required for us to exist. Now, that's not a fine-tuning problem in the sense that you're turning a parameter. It's a fine-tuning problem in the sense of how the universe appears to be designed. If you were designing a universe, you wouldn't have elephants popping into existence and going away within every human body. That's not really happening. It's the analogy. And you wouldn't make that a necessary part of the universe in order for life to exist. But it is. So it's not just the parameters, it's the laws of physics themselves in some sense, and all the ramifications and the consequences of those laws of physics that allow us to exist. And it's all over the place.
So on that point of the laws of physics and their effects on us, I mean, this is a big question of whether or not God had a choice in designing the laws of physics. Do you have a stake on that debate?
God can do anything that's possible. So I don't know what universes are possible. I would think there's a whole bunch that are out there that are possible. Right? In fact, the person who claims that the only reason we exist is because we're in the right multiverse would make that same claim. But there's a whole bunch of possible universes out there. So if that's true, and if the laws of physics are different in them, then God had a choice in making the universes.
Yeah, that's an interesting discussion because it does raise, other discussions too, relating not to the design of the universe necessarily, but to, for example, ethics, whether or not what makes right is because God says so, or God says it's right because it's right in the first place, right? In other words, is God subject to certain laws, whether they be ethical or physical?
I think neither of those alternatives are right, although one of them might be close to what I think is correct. Ethics are based on God's character, not on what he says.
Okay.
Now, what he says comes from his character, but it's God isn't arbitrarily choosing to say what's right and wrong. God's character defines what's right and wrong.
Can you say more about that?
His essence, his how he was born, in your words, right? Who he is.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting.
And it's not arbitrary, yeah. So goodness is defined by the goodness of God. He can't,
Would you say there's like an equivalent about design, that the design is consistent with his character in such a way, or do you?
I would say the design is consistent with his purposes.
With his purposes.
Which I don't know, yeah. There is evil and suffering in this world. God's character is not evil, but he could create a world with the potential of evil, even if he's not evil, if it was for a grandiose or a better purpose, to defeat evil, let's say. If my earlier speculation is correct, he creates a universe as a good God. He creates a universe with the potential of evil in order to defeat evil. I mean, again, you could go off, well, is that the only way he could do it? He's God. Can he find another way? I don't know the answers to that.
Fair enough. And so you've obviously encountered other physicists who are familiar with the fine-tuning, with the precise nature of the constants that need to be in place for our life to exist, but I'm sure you've encountered some that don't believe in God, despite being familiar with these.
Yeah, and there's answers. The multiverse is one answer. Another answer is we only have one data point. So Sabine Hossenfelder would say we don't know that any of it's kind of what you said, we don't know that any of the parameters could have different values. Maybe there's something brute fact that they have to have the values they have. Now, they might appear fine-tuned then, but they're not. I'm not sure that solves the problem because you've kind of pushed it back. Well, what is it that forces them to have these values? But we don't understand everything about the universe. You know, I won't go into all the details, but there are, of why I've been thinking about this. As long as there are things we don't know about the universe, you can always come up with a model that doesn't require God. It's that simple. As long as there are things we don't know about the universe, you can always come up with a model that doesn't require God. But my question is, given what we do know about the universe, what's the most likely? And I would say it is, the Judeo-Christian God of the Bible. It doesn't certainly solve every issue, as you brought up. The problem of evil and suffering is a challenging issue for any worldview. I mean, you know what a Christian theologian would say, that they would argue that without a moral absolute lawgiver, then there is no problem of evil because there's no such thing as evil, right? I mean, I find that a compelling argument. If there is no absolute standard of good and evil, then good and evil becomes only what an individual defines it as. And any individual or society can redefine it at any time. But yet, inherently, we know that's not true. Killing babies for sport is always wrong, regardless of what society says. So to me, I believe philosophically, without an external moral God, then you don't have a problem with evil, because there's no such thing as evil. And I've read many philosophers that I don't think they can argue against that in any way that's satisfactory to me.
Well, I can actually introduce you to one who might actually.
Okay.
Professor Yuzo Nagasawa, he wrote a paper on the problem of evil for atheists.
Right.
So you might be interested in it.
Send me the paper.
I'd
love reading people I don't agree with, because it changes my mind.
Well, you may agree with it, because he ultimately concludes that the theist has a better prospects at answering the problem of evil than the atheist.
And I would argue that's true. I would argue that's true, even though it's always brought up as an attack against theism or trying to refute theism. I really do believe that the theist has a better answer to the problem of evil, particularly the Christian, who says this is only temporary. The problem of evil will be taken care of. We will live in that society without pain and suffering someday, and that God paid a huge price for that to happen. I mean, that to me is a loving God who pays a huge price so that we can live in that society. Again, you could ask the question, why couldn't he do it another way? And I don't know the answer. But I would argue it has to do with what I said before. It has to do with his character. The one thing I know about God is he cannot violate his character. He's always true to who he is at the core.
Well, I do have a lot I would like to respond about the problem of evil, but I know we're running short on time here. So anything else by way of introducing or trying to convince someone of a design?
Did we even talk about the design argument? A little bit. No, I mean, again, one can argue whether or not the universe is really designed. But I think it's hard to make an argument that it doesn't appear designed. There's always somebody who's going to make that argument. That it's hard to make the argument. Even Francis Crick said that we have to keep reminding ourselves that biological systems only appear designed. To me, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, maybe it really is a duck. And so I think, in fact, I won't mention his name, but I will. So one of the atheists I most respect is Sean Carroll. He's a theoretical physicist who writes a lot. He's very thoughtful atheist. He's made me think deeply about many of my beliefs and how strong the evidence for them is. And he would argue that the fine-tuning is the best argument for God there is. And he is an atheist, so he doesn't believe it. But I think among many people who aren't convinced there's a God at all, understand that this, to some degree, is a weighty argument.
Alrighty, well, Dr.
That's a good place to end, maybe.
It is.
Yeah.
Dr. Strauss, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure talking with you.
Appreciate you, sir. Thank you.